A millionaire and his loyal German shepherd were driving through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago when they saw her. A little girl, only 8 years old, kneeling in the cold with a torn backpack clutched to her chest, tears running down her cheeks as thunder rolled above. Her trembling voice pleaded, "Please, don't throw me out. I have nowhere to go." In that instant, fate stopped him in his tracks. What happened next would shatter the silence of his past, reveal a secret he never expected, and lead to a miracle of family and second chances. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever be left alone in the storm, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see the world. The rain came down in relentless sheets over Chicago, turning the sidewalks into glistening rivers and the narrow alleys into dark canals. It was late afternoon, but the sky hung heavy and gray, as though the sun had been swallowed whole. The winds funneled between the tall apartment buildings on the south side, carrying with them a biting chill that clung to every bone. On the porch of a weather-beaten brick tenement stood a man whose figure seemed to absorb the storm itself. Victor Hale, a man in his late 40s, had once been a soldier, and his body still bore the rigid posture of military discipline, though years of bitterness and alcohol had carved deep furrows into his face. His frame was broad but softened with neglect, his cropped hair streaked with gray, and his eyes bloodshot, their sharpness dulled by whiskey. Once a man who had fought for his country, Victor now fought only with his demons. War had left him broken, angry, and short-tempered, turning every gesture into violence and every word into a bark. In his hand he clutched a tattered backpack, old and patched, the kind that belonged to a child who had long outgrown the luxury of toys or new clothes. With a sudden roar of frustration, Victor hurled the bag into the rain-soaked yard, the splash echoing off the concrete. The bag's owner, Emily Parker, stumbled forward. She was a frail 8-year-old girl, small even for her age, with a narrow frame that spoke of skipped meals and nights spent shivering in thin blankets. Her long brown hair, tangled and damp, clung to her pale cheeks, and her wide hazel eyes carried both fear and innocence, like glass that had seen too much too soon. Emily's thin arms reached desperately for the backpack, as if it contained her entire life, and in truth, it did. Inside were the only remnants of her mother, a few scraps of clothing, and a small wooden box she guarded with her very soul. She clutched the backpack to her chest and fell to her knees on the wet pavement, rain mingling with the tears that streamed down her face. Her voice cracked and echoed through the storm. "Please, please don't throw me out on the street. I have nowhere to go." The neighbors were there, though none dared intervene. From the shadows of doorways and beneath the meager shelter of plastic tarps, they watched. Some whispered, others turned away. They all knew Victor Hale, the man who had served in uniform and returned home with more scars on the inside than out. His temper was legendary in this part of town, his fists quick to strike, his threats louder than thunder. People avoided his wrath the way one avoids a downed electrical line, with fear and distance. They pitied the girl but chose silence. Victor stepped forward, the heels of his boots splashing in the puddles, his hand now gripping a rattan cane he sometimes carried like a weapon. His eyes narrowed as he raised it, the storm reflected in their fury. The child cowered, her small hands trembling around her soaked backpack. For Victor, Emily was not family, not even a responsibility. She was a burden, a reminder of promises he had once made to a dying woman, a fellow soldier's widow that he could no longer honor. His voice was low, roughened by drink and rage. "Get out! You're not my problem anymore." Just then, a pair of headlights cut through the curtain of rain, sweeping across the yard and casting long shadows of man and child upon the wall. A sleek black car rolled to a stop at the curb, its engine purring before falling silent. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man whose presence seemed almost out of place in such a forgotten neighborhood. Thomas Reed was 45, a self-made millionaire who had risen in the world through the booming tech industry. His appearance carried the polish of success. Tall, with a commanding presence, his dark hair neatly combed though touched with silver at the temples, and his sharp gray eyes observant, intelligent, yet softened by something deeper loneliness. Widowed years earlier, Thomas had poured himself into his company, but despite his wealth, he often found himself adrift in a cavernous home filled with silence. His tailored coat was soon drenched by the rain, but he didn't flinch. His gaze locked on the tableau before him, a man looming over a small girl in despair. Beside him leapt down a dog, large and muscular, his coat a striking mix of black and tan. Max, a 5-year-old German shepherd, had been Thomas's constant companion since the dog was a pup. Max had the proud bearing of his breed-erect ears, intelligent amber eyes, and a body trained by instinct to protect. Loyal to the bone, Max carried himself with the calm authority of a guardian, though beneath that discipline was a gentleness reserved for those in need. Tonight, sensing danger, Max's hackles rose and a deep growl rumbled from his chest. He padded forward, placing himself between Emily and Victor, his gaze fixed, unblinking, on the man with the cane. Thomas took in the scene with measured calm, his voice even but carrying weight. "What's going on here?" he asked, his words cutting through the drizzle. Victor spun around, his jaw tightening with annoyance at the intrusion, his tone bristling with contempt. "None of your business." But Thomas didn't move, his expression unchanged, the rain dripping steadily from his brow. His eyes dropped briefly to Emily, who clutched the backpack as though it were her heart itself. The child trembled, her lips quivering, her small body hunched against the storm. Max stepped closer, his body forming a wall of fur and muscle between the girl and her tormentor. Emily's small hand, hesitant and shaking, reached out to touch the dog's head. Max lowered himself slightly, his amber eyes softening as her fingers brushed against his damp fur. He gave a small, reassuring lick to her hand, a gesture that startled her into a momentary stillness. Around them, the neighbors whispered more urgently, some crossing themselves, others muttering that this stranger and his dog were fools to provoke Victor Hale. Yet none stepped forward, they simply watched, shadows under the storm. Victor lifted the cane as though to swat Max aside, but the German shepherd let out a sudden bark, loud and fierce, echoing off the alley walls like the crack of a rifle. Victor faltered, taken aback, lowering his arm. His eyes flickered with something rarely seen in them, hesitation. Max's growl deepened, the dog's stance steady, unwavering. For the first time that evening, Emily's tears slowed, replaced by the faintest flicker of hope. The stranger had not walked past. His dog had stood for her when no one else dared. Thomas, calm yet firm, spoke again, his words sharper this time. "It became my business the moment I heard that child beg not to be thrown out." His eyes met Victor's, gray steel against red fury. The rain drummed harder on the pavement, thunder rolled in the distance, and for a breathless moment, time itself seemed suspended between violence and salvation. Max, steady as a sentinel, pressed against Emily's side, his tail sweeping once against the ground as though to reassure her. She was not alone anymore. And there, in that sodden Chicago yard beneath the judgment of silent neighbors and the watch of a loyal dog, fate shifted. Emily Parker, the little girl who thought she had no one left in the world, had found an unexpected protector. Thomas Reed had made his decision. The storm had not eased. If anything, it pressed heavier against the streets of Chicago, drumming against rusted gutters and slicking the cracked sidewalks into mirrors of trembling light. In the small yard, the tension had thickened like the rain-soaked air. Victor Hale's jaw twitched as he glared at Thomas Reed, the intruding stranger, and at the dog that had placed itself between him and the child. Victor's face was ruddy, his fists clenching the cane as though he could still take control by sheer force. He barked, "That girl is a thief!" She took what wasn't hers. After all, I gave her food, a roof she stole from me. Tell me, doesn't that sound like betrayal? His voice cracked with both fury and the unmistakable slur of alcohol. Emily Parker shrank back, clutching the soaked backpack as if it were armor. Her thin lips parted, and though her voice trembled, it carried a small core of resolve. "I didn't steal," she whispered, then repeated, louder this time, "I didn't take anything." Her hazel eyes widened, pleading not just for belief, but for rescue, for someone to finally hear her truth. Thomas studied her carefully. Rain ran down his temples, dampening the fine wool of his overcoat, but he didn't move to wipe it away. Instead, he crouched so that he was level with Emily, lowering himself until his gray eyes met hers. He had always been a man of logic and precision, a businessman whose instincts weighed truth like data. But here, before this trembling child, his instincts were different, human, instinctive. The slight quiver of her voice, the way her small shoulders hunched as if they had known the weight of too much, and the bruises barely visible beneath her sleeves told him more than words ever could. Without a word, Thomas slipped off his overcoat, ignoring how the rain stung against his shirt sleeves, and placed it gently over Emily's shoulders. The coat hung heavy on her frail body, its warmth seeping into the chill that had wrapped around her bones. She blinked in astonishment, as though no one had ever thought to shield her before. "You're coming with me," Thomas said firmly, his voice calm yet unyielding, as though pronouncing a verdict. Victor let out a harsh laugh, his eyes narrowing. "With you?" "She's mine to deal with. Don't think a fancy suit and a mutt give you the right to walk into my yard." He stepped forward, the cane lifting. But before he could take more than a stride, Max erupted with a bark so sharp and sudden it seemed to shake the windows. The German shepherd's teeth flashed in the dim light, his stance low and protective. His amber eyes locked onto Victor's every movement, daring him to come closer. Victor faltered, his knuckles whitening around the cane, but he didn't swing it. For once, fear flickered across his hardened features. The neighbors stirred at this display. A frail, stooped woman stepped slightly out from the shadows of her porch. She was perhaps in her 70s, her hair silver and bound in a bun, her thin hands gripping the wooden frame of the doorway as though it were the only thing holding her upright. Her name was Mrs. Lorraine Carter, a longtime resident of the block who had watched generations grow and suffer. Her voice, though weak, carried clearly through the rain. "That child has done nothing but work, morning to night," she said. "I've seen her carrying buckets of water, scrubbing his steps. More work than any child should do, and when night falls, she sleeps in the shed, not in the house." Her words, though quiet, struck with the force of truth. Murmurs rippled among the other neighbors, though none dared speak louder than a whisper. Victor's face darkened, his glare shooting toward Mrs. Carter. "Old woman, keep your mouth shut." His anger was hot, but there was a tremor in it now, the kind of tremor that came when lies were beginning to unravel. He took another step, but Max responded with another guttural growl, louder, closer. Emily instinctively pressed against the dog's side, her small fingers gripping the damp fur, and Max responded by lowering his head to nuzzle her hand briefly before returning his gaze to the threat. The gesture was protective, but it was also oddly tender, as if Max had already chosen his allegiance. Thomas noticed something then. Max had been sniffing at Emily's backpack earlier, a low whine rising in his throat, almost like recognition. When the dog turned back toward him now, there was something questioning in his amber eyes, as though he had caught a scent that tied this girl to something familiar. Thomas frowned, unsettled. His late wife, Anna, had once kept a box of cedar trinkets that always smelled faintly of lavender. For a fleeting second, he wondered if Max's unusual reaction was more than simple curiosity. He pushed the thought aside, but the seed of it remained. Victor's rage built like thunder, but he no longer had the advantage. The neighbors were watching, the old woman had spoken, and the stranger with steel in his gaze had declared his intent. Victor spat on the ground, the saliva mixing with rain. "Take her then," he sneered, "but don't say I didn't warn you. She's trouble. You'll regret it." Yet his words lacked conviction, his retreat betrayed by the subtle step backward. Thomas extended his hand to Emily. "Come," he said softly. The girl hesitated, her small fingers clutching the straps of her backpack, but then slowly she placed her hand into his. His grip was firm yet warm, steadying her trembling. Max moved in closer, brushing against Emily's side as if guiding her toward safety. Together, the three of them turned toward the sleek car idling at the curb, the headlights cutting through the downpour like beacons. The neighbors whispered again. Some shook their heads, fearful of what Victor might do in revenge, while others dared to let hope flicker across their weathered faces. Mrs. Carter remained by her doorway, her thin lips pressed into a line, her eyes following the child with something like relief. She whispered almost to herself, "Maybe now she'll be safe." Victor stood rooted in the yard, his cane dangling at his side, his chest heaving with impotent fury. For once he was not the strongest presence there. The rain seemed to beat him down, washing away his power. As Thomas led Emily toward the car, Max paused once, turning his head back toward Victor, his growl low and lingering, a warning that no further harm would be tolerated. Victor flinched but said nothing. Emily climbed into the car, her small frame swallowed by the large leather seat, the coat still draped around her shoulders. Max hopped in after her, positioning himself by her side. Thomas slid in behind the wheel, his face set with grim determination. As the engine hummed to life, the last thing Emily saw through the blurred glass was Victor, standing in the rain, diminished, his figure fading into the storm. The storm followed them as Thomas Reed's black sedan moved steadily through the narrow streets, windshield wipers beating a constant rhythm against the downpour. Inside the car, Emily Parker sat small and stiff in the leather seat, Thomas's coat still draped over her narrow shoulders. The coat looked comically large, but she held it closed as if afraid it might be taken from her at any moment. Beside her, Max lay curled on the floor of the car, his ears twitching, his amber eyes occasionally lifting to study the girl. Whenever she shifted nervously, Max nudged her hand with his nose, grounding her in ways words could not. Thomas drove in silence, though his mind roiled with thoughts. The name Grace, the image of the girl's eyes so painfully familiar, the sound of her pleas, all of it gnawed at him. He needed clarity, but right now clarity could wait. The child needed warmth, food, and safety, not another round of questions. With a decisive turn of the wheel, he pulled into the parking lot of a small diner on the corner of Roosevelt Road. The glowing neon sign buzzed faintly in the rain, promising hot meals and shelter. The diner itself was modest, with wide windows fogged from the steam of the kitchen. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of frying bacon, simmering soup, and fresh coffee. The linoleum floors were worn but clean, and the booths were lined with faded red leather. The few late-night patrons turned their heads briefly at the sight of the millionaire in his soaked shirt sleeves, a bedraggled girl clutching a backpack, and the large German shepherd who followed close at their heels. Behind the counter stood Helen Simmons, the diner's owner and cook, a woman in her early 60s. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair cropped short and laugh lines etched deeply into her face. Yet those laugh lines were tempered by a certain hardness in her eyes, the kind carried by someone who had lived through loss. Her husband had been a steelworker who died in an accident decades earlier, and she had raised 2 boys alone while running the diner. The hardships had given her both toughness and compassion in equal measure. She wiped her hands on a white apron as she looked at Thomas and the child, curiosity flickering across her features before softening into something kinder. "Sit anywhere you like," Helen said warmly, though her eyes lingered on Emily a little longer, taking in the girl's soaked hair and trembling fingers. Thomas guided Emily to a corner booth, sliding in across from her, while Max stretched out beneath the table, his head positioned protectively against Emily's leg. A waitress, Molly Jenkins, approached with a small notepad. Molly was a young woman in her 20s, with auburn hair tied back in a ponytail and freckles scattered across her cheeks. Her manner was cheerful but gentle, a contrast to the weariness in her gray-blue eyes, the kind of weariness that came from working double shifts to cover rent. "What can I get you folks tonight?" she asked. Her gaze softened when it fell on Emily. "Hungry, sweetheart?" Emily nodded hesitantly, her voice barely audible. "Soup, please." Thomas added, 2 bowls of soup, bread, and something warm to drink for her. He didn't order for himself, though Molly insisted gently, "Coffee for you, sir?" He gave a brief nod. When the food arrived, Emily stared at it as though unsure it was truly hers. The steam from the chicken noodle soup fogged her face, and the smell made her stomach twist with hunger. Yet she ate cautiously, dipping small spoonfuls, breaking the bread into tiny pieces before soaking them in the broth. Her manners were precise, almost overly so, as if she had been scolded in the past for eating too quickly or spilling. Max shifted under the table, his tail brushing against her ankles, and she bent down just enough to rest her fingers on his head between bites. Every few minutes he placed his chin gently on her lap, his warm breath reminding her she wasn't alone. Thomas watched quietly, his hands clasped, his coffee cooling untouched. Finally, he asked in a voice that was calm but deliberate, "Where are your parents, Emily?" The girl froze, her spoon hovering above the bowl. Her hazel eyes dropped, shadows pooling in them, After a long silence, she whispered, "My mom. She passed away when I was 6." Her small hand tightened on the strap of her backpack beneath the table. "I never knew my dad." The words trembled, not with self-pity but with the fragile acceptance of a child who had repeated them too many times to herself. Thomas's chest tightened. The resemblance to Anna, his late wife, grew heavier in his mind, though he didn't let it show on his face. He leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering. "You said earlier someone named Grace helped you?" Emily's gaze lifted a little, cautious but flickering with something softer. "Grace was my mom's friend. She was kind. She stood up for me sometimes when Uncle Victor—" Her voice trailed off, the sentence unfinished but understood. The name struck Thomas like a sudden chord. Grace Miller. Anna had once spoken of her dearest friend, a confidant she could always trust. The memory was faint but sharp enough to sting, and the realization unsettled him. Could this child truly be tied to Anna's world? His pulse quickened, but he forced his expression to remain steady. Helen Simmons approached the booth then, carrying a fresh basket of bread. She placed it on the table, her eyes resting on Emily. "I've seen this girl before," she said quietly, more to Thomas than to the child. "She came by here a few times. Not to eat, just stood by the back door. We gave her scraps once or twice. Too polite to ask, though, just stood there with those big eyes." Helen's gaze hardened slightly as it shifted toward Thomas. "Whatever you're doing, mister, I hope you're doing right by her." Emily's cheeks flushed, her small fingers twisting around the edge of the bread. The shame of being remembered as the child who begged silently for scraps seemed to wound her more than the memory of hunger itself. Thomas reached across the table, resting his hand briefly on hers. She looked at him, startled, but did not pull away. Max gave a quiet huff, resting his head firmly on Emily's lap, as if to remind her that none of it mattered anymore, that she was safe, at least for now. The rain outside had lessened to a drizzle, and neon lights reflected in wavering puddles. Inside the diner, though, warmth reigned, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the comfort of food. For the first time in years, Emily's small body relaxed enough to eat until her bowl was empty. She leaned back in the booth, her eyes heavy with fatigue but calmer than they had been in the storm. Thomas sat back as well, his mind torn between unanswered questions and the simple, undeniable truth before him. This girl had known hunger, fear, and abandonment, yet she carried herself with quiet resilience. And her presence, her name, her friend Grace, had pulled memories of Anna back into his heart like ghosts rising from the rain. The drive from the diner carried them away from the neon-lit bustle of Roosevelt Road toward the quieter stretches of the Chicago River. The storm had softened into a mist, the streets gleaming as though freshly polished, and the towering skyline gave way to wider avenues lined with trees whose bare branches dripped silver in the dim light. Emily sat silent in the back seat, her small hands folded tightly over her backpack, the oversized coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She leaned against the window, watching unfamiliar streets flicker past, her face pale and unreadable. Beside her, Max shifted occasionally, resting his head against her knee, his amber eyes flicking toward her with the quiet watchfulness of a guardian. At last the car slowed in front of a gated estate set along the riverbank. The house itself loomed large, built of pale stone and glass, with long windows that looked out over the water. Lights glowed warmly from within, casting golden reflections across the wet driveway. To Emily, it seemed impossibly grand, like something from a storybook, and she shrank deeper into the coat as Thomas parked and stepped out. He moved around to open her door, extending his hand, but she hesitated, reluctant to cross into a world that felt too big, too strange. Max nudged her softly, coaxing her forward, and with a deep breath she placed her small hand into Thomas's, allowing him to help her out of the car. Waiting at the top of the steps was a woman in her late 50s, her posture straight though softened by age. Martha Whitaker, the longtime housekeeper of the Reed estate, had worked for Thomas's family for more than 2 decades. She was tall and slightly plump, with iron-gray hair pulled neatly into a bun and kind brown eyes that rarely missed a detail. Her face bore both the lines of age and the traces of patience, for she had endured years of caring for the household after Anna's death, becoming as much a silent anchor for Thomas as a keeper of his home. Though reserved with strangers, Martha's heart was steady and compassionate, shaped by the early loss of her own son in an accident, an old grief she carried with quiet strength. Martha's gaze softened as she saw Emily standing timidly behind Thomas, her hair still damp, her shoes muddy. "Sir," Martha said gently, "this is—" Thomas gave a small nod. "This is Emily. She'll be staying with us tonight. I'll explain everything later." His voice was low but firm, leaving no room for doubt. Emily, however, heard none of the reassurance. Her eyes darted nervously from the gleaming chandeliers in the entryway to the polished marble floors that seemed far too clean to touch. She clutched her backpack tighter and blurted out in a small, trembling voice, "I can work. I can wash dishes, scrub floors. I don't need my own room." Her words carried the quick defensiveness of someone who expected to be rejected. Martha froze for a heartbeat, her heart breaking at the child's instinctive plea, then stepped closer, her voice soft and maternal. "No, dear. You don't have to do any of that. Come inside. You need a bath and warm clothes, not chores." She extended her hand, but Emily hung back, uncertain. It was Max who bridged the distance. The dog padded forward into the house, then stopped halfway and turned, fixing Emily with a steady gaze. He let out a low, encouraging whine, tail sweeping once across the floor, as if telling her the path was safe. Emily's lips parted, and after a moment she took a hesitant step forward, following Max inside. Martha guided her gently through the echoing halls, past portraits and shelves lined with books, to a guest room prepared in haste. The room glowed with lamplight, its bed layered with soft blankets, and a small wardrobe stood open with fresh clothes folded neatly inside. To Emily it felt too perfect, too far from the shed where she had been sleeping, and she lingered by the door as though afraid to disturb anything. Martha knelt slightly, her voice kind. "The bathroom is ready, sweet one. Take your time. I'll bring you something warm to drink when you're finished." She placed a hand briefly on Emily's shoulder before stepping out. While Emily bathed and changed, Thomas remained in his study, staring out the tall windows at the rain-dappled river. His thoughts were tangled, circling back to Anna, to the name Grace, and to the way Emily's eyes mirrored a gaze he had once known so well. His world had always been built on certainty, on numbers and contracts and facts, yet tonight uncertainty gnawed at him in ways he had not felt in years. Max padded into the study briefly, shaking water from his coat before lying by the hearth. The dog's amber eyes reflected the flickering firelight, as though he too carried unspoken questions. Later that evening, Martha brought Emily downstairs for a light supper. She wore a simple cotton dress, clean but several sizes too big, and her damp hair had been combed into soft waves. She ate quietly, her small hands folded neatly on the table when not holding a fork, though every so often her eyes flicked nervously around the room as if waiting for someone to scold her. Max lay nearby, his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes never strayed far from her. Afterward, Martha led her back upstairs to bed. Emily's new room was warm, the blankets heavy and soft. She lay down but clutched her backpack tightly against her chest, unwilling to let it out of her sight. The soft glow of the bedside lamp should have lulled her to sleep, but her body remained tense, her eyes wide. At last, exhaustion pulled her under, though not into peace. Her lips moved as she muttered in her dreams, fragmented words tumbling out. "Don't. I'll wash it clean. Please don't." Her small body twisted beneath the blanket, as if reliving the punishments she had endured. Thomas, restless himself, had been walking the hallway when he heard her faint voice through the door. His chest tightened, but before he could enter, a sound came from the other side, a quiet thump, followed by a scratching at the wood. Max was there, sitting firmly outside Emily's door, pawing gently as though insisting his master respond. Thomas pushed the door open softly. Inside, Emily thrashed lightly in her sleep, clutching the backpack as tears streaked her cheeks. Thomas crossed the room, kneeling by her bed. He laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "Emily," he whispered, his voice steady and soothing. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." Slowly her breathing eased, the tension in her small body loosening as though some part of her had heard. Max padded inside, circling once before lying down by the bed, his head resting near Emily's hand. The girl's fingers brushed against his fur in her sleep, and her lips softened into the faintest trace of calm. Thomas sat there for a long while, the storm finally breaking outside into silence, his heart heavy yet filled with an unfamiliar resolve. The child was more than just a chance encounter. Something deeper tied them together, though the truth had not yet been spoken. For now, all that mattered was that she was here, safe, and that for the first time in years his home did not feel so unbearably empty. The following morning dawned gray but calm, the river outside the windows carrying a thin veil of mist. The Reed mansion felt unusually alive, though the silence still pressed like a heavy curtain. Emily awoke early, her thin frame curled up with her backpack hugged tightly against her chest. Max lay sprawled across the rug near her bed, his ears flicking at every small sound, always alert. When Emily sat up, blinking uncertainly in the unfamiliar softness of the room, Max stretched and patted over, pressing his nose into her hand as though reminding her she was no longer alone. Downstairs, Martha Whitaker was gathering laundry from the hall. Years of tending this household had taught her to notice every detail, every shift in tone. Her eyes were drawn to Emily's backpack, resting against the chair where the girl had placed it before sitting at the breakfast table. It was old, its fabric frayed, the straps patched with uneven stitching. Something about the way Emily hovered near it, as though it were a lifeline, tugged at Martha's heart. As Emily drank warm milk in the kitchen, Martha carefully carried the bag to a side table, intending to fold the straps back into place. But as she adjusted the worn zipper, a folded stack of papers slid out. She frowned, unfolding them slowly, and her eyes scanned the messy handwriting. What she found made her lips press into a thin line of outrage. The paper listed debts in columns, paired with endless chores. Wash dishes, 30 times, scrub floors, 20 times, haul water, 50 times. Yet each task was followed by deductions. Light bulb fee, hallway cleaning charge, rent due. The balance was always negative, designed so the child would never be free. Martha's hands trembled as she set the paper down. Her face flushed with anger, though she quickly composed herself. She had raised children once, long ago, before tragedy claimed her only son, and to see this kind of cruelty inflicted on another child awakened an old fire in her. She glanced toward Emily, who was carefully eating a slice of toast, unaware that her quiet torment had just been laid bare. Thomas entered the kitchen then, his expression calm but drawn with sleeplessness. Martha showed him the papers, her voice low and edged with anger. "Look at this, sir." This is what Victor Hale demanded of her. Thomas's eyes darkened as he read, his jaw tightening. "This isn't debt. This is slavery." He crumpled the page in his fist, though his gaze softened as he looked toward Emily. She sat still, watching with wide eyes, fear rising at the thought she had done something wrong. Thomas crouched beside her chair, his voice gentle. "You don't owe anyone anything, Emily. Do you understand?" "Not anymore," Emily nodded faintly, though her fingers clenched her backpack again. "Mom told me to keep it safe," she murmured, her voice fragile but steady. "Inside, there's something I have to protect." She said it's our family's secret. Her eyes flickered with hesitation before she slowly unzipped the bag. From its depths, she drew out a small wooden box, old and worn smooth with age, its corners chipped but still sturdy. She held it tightly in both hands, her expression one of reverence. The box was plain, carved from dark cedar, but when Thomas saw it, his breath caught in his throat. He recognized the faint pattern etched into the lid. Anna's father had once been a carpenter, and Thomas remembered seeing that same style years ago in Anna's possessions. His heart thudded as Emily set the box on the table. Max, curious, padded closer and sniffed at it. His ears perked, and he let out a low whine before turning to Thomas. Then, in an almost uncanny gesture, Max placed his paw on Thomas's hand, as though confirming what Thomas already feared to believe. Martha's eyes darted between them, her own breath quickening. "Go on, sir," she whispered. Thomas's fingers hovered over the lid. He hesitated, afraid of what truths might lie within, yet compelled by a force stronger than doubt. He opened the box carefully. Inside lay a faded photograph, its edges frayed, the image blurred by time but unmistakable. It was Anna, his Anna much younger, her long brown hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes filled with both warmth and sorrow. In her arms, she held a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Beside the photograph was a folded piece of paper, a birth certificate. Thomas unfolded it with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the name written in faded ink, Emily Reed. His vision blurred, and he had to blink rapidly as the words seared into him. The world seemed to tilt. For years he had buried himself in work, shutting away the grief of losing Anna, never knowing she had carried more of him than just memory. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the walls of his carefully built life crumbling in an instant. Emily, this small, trembling child sitting across from him, was not a stranger. She was his daughter. Emily watched him, confusion clouding her eyes at his sudden silence. Is something wrong?" she asked timidly, clutching the edge of her seat. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice thick. "No, Emily. Nothing's wrong." He reached out, brushing his hand across the photograph, then looked back at her, his gray eyes shimmering with a storm of emotions he could not yet name. "You said your mother gave this to you?" Emily nodded quickly. "She told me never to lose it. She said one day it would tell me who I really was." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "She said it's our family's secret." Max leaned his weight against Thomas's leg, sensing the flood of emotion coursing through his master. The dog's steady presence anchored him, reminding him he was not lost, not entirely. Thomas closed the box with deliberate care, his fingers resting against the lid for a long moment before he exhaled. Martha stood by silently, her eyes moist. She had served this household long enough to remember Anna, to remember the brightness she once brought into these walls. To see that brightness now reflected in Emily's fragile face was almost unbearable. She placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, a silent offering of strength. Thomas looked at Emily again, his throat tightening. He could not yet tell her the truth, not when the shock still burned through him, but the knowledge had already changed everything. He would never let her be cast aside again. She was his blood, his child, his Anna's final gift. The morning after the discovery of the wooden box, Thomas Reed could not sit still. He had spent the night pacing between his study and the hallway outside Emily's room, his thoughts circling like restless birds. The photograph, the birth certificate, the undeniable truth, they had shattered the walls he had built around his heart. Emily was his daughter, yet so many questions remained unanswered. Why had Anna never told him? Why had she hidden the pregnancy? And how had the child ended up in the hands of a man like Victor Hale? The name Emily had whispered at the diner still echoed in his mind. Grace, Anna's closest friend. If anyone had answers, it would be her. By late morning, Thomas had arranged for the car to take him across the city to a quiet residential neighborhood. Emily stayed behind with Martha, who promised to keep her safe. Max, however, refused to be left behind. The German shepherd sat squarely in the doorway, ears erect, until Thomas relented with a sigh. "Fine, boy. Come on, then." The house they arrived at was small but well kept, painted a gentle shade of cream with flower boxes beneath the windows. A narrow garden stretched along the side, filled with lavender and marigolds, though the blooms were battered by the recent rain. On the porch stood a woman who looked as if she had been waiting. Grace Miller was in her mid-40s, her frame slender but wiry with a strength born from years of endurance. Her hair, once dark, was streaked with silver, pulled into a loose braid that hung over one shoulder. Her face was pale, drawn with fine lines not only of age but of sorrow and vigilance. Her eyes, gray-blue, sharp yet vulnerable, spoke of someone who had lived long with secrets too heavy to bear. Grace froze when she saw Thomas. Her hands trembled slightly on the doorframe. "Thomas Reed," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why are you here after all this time?" Thomas stepped forward, his face lined with grief and urgency. He held out the wooden box, its surface still damp from his grip. "Because of Anna, and because of the child." At the mention of the child, Grace's expression shifted. Her shoulders stiffened, her eyes darting away, her lips pressing into a tight line. "She didn't want you to know," she murmured. "She begged me not to tell you." Thomas's voice cracked as he spoke. "She's my daughter. My blood. Do you understand what I saw in that box? Anna holding our baby, the certificate Grace. Why was I never told?" Grace's composure faltered. She turned away, leading him inside the modest living room, its walls lined with books and photographs of landscapes rather than people. She gestured for him to sit, though he remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. Max padded in after him, sniffing curiously at the corners before circling near the back door. Grace sat on the edge of a worn sofa, her hands twisting together in her lap. At last, she lifted her gaze. "Anna was pregnant when you divorced. She knew the battles you were fighting, the company, the investors, the constant pressure. She was terrified that if you knew, it would ruin you. Her family had never approved of you, and she had no one else to turn to. She thought keeping the baby a secret would protect you from more pain. She believed she could raise the child alone. Thomas's jaw tightened, his heart tearing as each word struck him. Protect me? She should have trusted me. I would have given everything for her, for that child. Grace's eyes glistened. She loved you, Thomas. More than anything. But she was sick, and she grew weaker every day. When Emily was small, Anna could barely work. She turned to Victor Hale. He had been in the army with her brother, and she thought he would be honorable, that he would keep his promise to look after Emily if she didn't survive. Grace's voice faltered, and she pressed her hands against her mouth, tears spilling between her fingers. She trusted the wrong man, and when she died, he betrayed her memory. Thomas felt his knees weaken, and he lowered himself into a chair across from her. His vision blurred as he covered his face with one hand. Pain surged through him, pain for Anna, for the years lost, for the little girl who had grown up thinking she had no father. While the two adults sat in heavy silence, Max had been nosing around the garden outside the back door. Suddenly, he scratched at the soil beneath a lavender bush, his claws scraping against something hard. He barked once, sharp and insistent. Thomas and Grace hurried outside, where Max had unearthed a small wooden tin, weathered but intact. Grace gasped when she saw it. I buried that years ago. I couldn't bear to keep it in plain sight. Thomas brushed away the dirt and opened the tin. Inside were several letters, the ink faded, the paper softened by time. His hands shook as he unfolded one. The handwriting was Anna's, elegant yet trembling. Thomas, if you ever find our child, please forgive me. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was leave you both in pain. Know that I loved you and our baby more than life itself. The words blurred as tears welled in his eyes. Grace placed a trembling hand on his arm. She wrote those, but never sent them. She was afraid. I was the only one she confided in. When she passed, I promised her I would keep the secret. But now I see how wrong I was. Thomas closed the letter carefully, pressing it against his chest. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Emily has suffered enough. She will never suffer again, not while I live. His gaze hardened with newfound resolve, gray eyes like steel. I will protect her, and I will make sure Victor Hale pays for what he did. Max, sitting proudly beside them with dirt still clinging to his paws, gave a low, approving bark, as if sealing the vow. Victor Hale had vanished from the block after that night in the rain, but shadows lingered where his presence once loomed. Weeks passed in uneasy calm, Emily slowly adapting to life within the walls of the riverside mansion. She began to laugh softly when Max nudged her to play, and she listened with wide-eyed awe when Martha told her bedtime stories. Yet far away, in a dimly lit tavern on the city's edge, Victor brooded over cheap whiskey, his mind clouded with rage and greed. He had heard the whispers first. The little girl he had cast aside now lived in a mansion by the river, recognized as the daughter of Thomas Reed, the tech millionaire. The news spread quickly through neighborhood gossip and tabloid snippets. To Victor, it felt like betrayal twice over, first by Anna's memory, now by Emily herself. The child he had used for labor, who had begged for scraps, was suddenly the key to wealth he believed should have been his. Victor's appearance had decayed with his descent. His once broad shoulders sagged under dirty jackets, his hair unkempt and streaked with grime, his eyes bloodshot from nights of drink. Yet the soldier in him still remained, a cunning, dangerous edge sharpened by desperation. He hatched a plan. If Thomas claimed Emily as his daughter, then Victor would demand payment for the 8 years he claimed to have raised her. To execute his scheme, he turned to a man he once knew from the underbelly of Chicago. Stanley Briggs, a forger with nimble fingers and a face lined by dishonesty, was small and wiry, his blonde hair thinning, his pale eyes quick and evasive. Stanley had once been a clerk before gambling debts forced him underground, selling false documents to whoever paid enough. Victor slammed a wad of cash on his table and hissed, "Make it look real. I want receipts, bills, contracts, everything to prove I raised her and Reed owes me." Days later, Victor strutted into the office of Daniel Collins, Thomas Reed's lawyer. Collins was a seasoned man in his 50s, tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and silver hair neatly combed back. Known for his cool precision, he carried himself with the confidence of decades spent in courtrooms. Victor spread the file of forged documents across the polished oak desk, his grin wide. This proves it. I took care of that girl. Reed owes me compensation. Collins adjusted his glasses, scanning each page with practiced eyes. His expression never shifted, though inwardly he marveled at the audacity. Rent invoices that bore mismatched signatures, receipts for food that referenced closed stores, even disciplinary notes describing Emily as lazy and troublesome. It was both outrageous and sloppy. Collins looked up slowly, his tone steady but laced with steel. Mr. Hale, this is forgery. Nothing here will hold in court. If you pursue this, you'll only expose yourself further. Victor's smugness faltered, his jaw tightening. He grabbed the papers, muttered curses under his breath, and stormed out. But humiliation only deepened his madness. If he couldn't bleed Reed with fake debts, he would do it with force. That night, while the mansion slept under a veil of fog, Victor returned. He moved with the stealth of an old soldier, prying open a side window with a crowbar. Inside, the halls glowed dimly with night lamps, shadows stretching long and silent. Upstairs, Emily slept soundly, clutching her backpack like a shield. Max dozed by the stairwell, his ears twitching. Then came the faint scrape of a shoe against tile. Max's head snapped up, his body stiffened, a low growl building in his chest before exploding into a furious bark. He launched toward the sound, nails scratching against the hardwood, his body a blur of muscle. But Victor was quicker than expected. He shoved open Emily's door, snatching the girl from her bed, her scream muffled by his rough hand. Max barreled forward, snarling, but the door slammed shut, his claws raking deep marks into the wood. His barks roared through the mansion, jolting Thomas awake. Thomas burst from his study, heart pounding. He saw the gouges on Emily's door, Max pawing frantically, barking in a frenzy. "Emily!" Thomas shouted, racing to the window where cold night air poured in, the curtains whipping wildly. They were gone. The mansion fell into chaos. Martha sobbed as she clutched the banister, while Collins, summoned quickly, barked into his phone, mobilizing every private investigator he could reach. Thomas grabbed his coat, his face pale but fierce. Max, panting, whined anxiously, and then bolted toward the back door. He sniffed, pawed, then darted out into the night. "Go, boy," Thomas urged. "Find her." What followed was a desperate chase through the city's underbelly. Max led the way, nose to the ground, following Emily's scent with unwavering precision. He guided Thomas through alleys, across abandoned lots, past rusted fences. Each time Thomas faltered, Max barked sharply, pulling him forward. The trail wound toward the southern docks, where warehouses loomed like dark sentinels against the misty river. Inside one of the warehouses, Emily sat bound to a chair, her small wrists tied with coarse rope. Her hazel eyes shone with terror, yet her lips trembled as she whispered into the shadows, "Max, please save me." Her voice cracked, but her faith in the dog was unshaken. Victor paced nearby, a pistol clutched in his hand. His breath reeked of whiskey, his face twisted with madness. "Reed will pay," he muttered. "He'll pay or he'll lose her forever." The creak of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Victor spun, aiming the gun. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, hands raised. Behind him, Max stalked silently, his body low, muscles taut as a bowstring. Victor sneered. "One more step, Reed, and she's gone." His hand shook, but his eyes gleamed with wild intent. Thomas's voice was calm, though his heart thundered. "You don't want this, Victor. You want money. Take me, not her." Victor's hesitation was brief, but it was all Max needed. The German shepherd lunged with explosive force, his teeth clamping onto Victor's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground with a metallic crack. Victor howled in pain, stumbling backward. Thomas rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. The struggle was brief. Thomas's rage was fueled not just by fury, but by a father's desperate love. He wrenched Victor's arm behind his back, pinning him as Max stood over them, snarling, teeth bared inches from Victor's throat. Emily sobbed with relief, tears streaming as Thomas cut the ropes binding her wrists. She flung herself into his arms, clinging fiercely. Max nosed against her side, whining softly, then licked her cheek as if to assure her it was truly over. The trial of Victor Hale was swift and decisive. The forged documents, the kidnapping, the testimonies of neighbors who had long watched Emily suffer it all stacked like stones against him. Daniel Collins stood in court, his tall frame radiating quiet authority, dismantling every lie with calm precision. The jury needed little persuasion. Victor sat slouched in his chair, his once proud shoulders hunched, his eyes bloodshot and vacant as the sentence was read. Years behind bars for fraud, abuse, and endangerment of a child. For the first time in decades, the neighbors whispered, justice had prevailed. When the verdict was announced, Thomas Reed felt an immense weight lift from his chest. Yet he did not cheer. Instead, his hand gripped Emily's small one tightly, the other resting on her shoulder, steadying her trembling frame. The child had endured more than anyone should, and now she would never again face those shadows alone. In the weeks that followed, the mansion by the river no longer echoed with emptiness. The laughter of a child now floated through its halls, mingling with the steady sound of Martha's footsteps and the occasional bark of Max, who patrolled as if the estate belonged to him. Paperwork was filed, hearings attended, and at last the day came when the judge declared it official. Emily Parker was legally recognized as Emily Reed, the biological daughter of Thomas. Tears streaked Thomas's face as he signed the final document, his signature trembling but sure. Emily clutched her backpack, though for the first time she did not hold it out of fear but out of habit, her hazel eyes shining with something brighter than hope certainty. Martha and Grace worked tirelessly to help the child adjust. Grace, who had carried Anna's secret for so long, now poured her energy into sharing memories of her late friend. She sat with Emily by the fireplace, describing Anna's gentle laugh, her fierce love, the lullabies she would hum even when her lungs ached with sickness. Grace's voice always trembled when she spoke of her, but Emily listened wide-eyed, soaking up every story like sunlight on cold skin. Martha, steady and warm, added small anecdotes. How Anna once filled the Reed home with the smell of lavender, how she painted the garden fence a ridiculous shade of blue just to make Thomas smile. Between them, Anna's presence seemed to live again, wrapping Emily in a love that had never truly left her. Max was never far from the girl. He followed her through the garden, sprawled at her feet while she read picture books, and at night curled outside her door, his breathing a steady rhythm that lulled her to sleep. One evening, Thomas surprised Emily with a small box wrapped in velvet. Inside was a polished leather collar, the metal tag engraved with 2 words, Family Protector, Emily. Emily gasped, her tiny fingers tracing the letters, then threw her arms around Max's neck. "It's perfect," she whispered, pressing her cheek against his fur. Max wagged his tail furiously, the collar glinting in the lamplight like a medal of honor. Then came the day Thomas had been planning quietly, Emily's first real birthday celebration. Though her actual birthday had passed months earlier, the date mattered little. What mattered was giving her the moment she had never truly had. The mansion's garden was transformed into a warm tableau. Strings of yellow lights twinkled between trees, casting a glow over the riverbank where the water rippled with the last rays of sunlight. Martha arranged a table with a white cloth, adorned with simple flowers, and a modest cake topped with 8 bright candles. Grace brought a framed photograph of Anna, placing it beside the cake with reverence. Anna's soft smile seemed to watch over them, a silent blessing. Emily wore a light blue dress Martha had sewn to fit her small frame. Her hair, once tangled and unkempt, now fell in soft curls over her shoulders. She fidgeted nervously, unused to being the center of attention, but Max stood proudly by her side, his amber eyes bright as if he understood the significance of the evening. Thomas knelt beside his daughter, lighting each candle carefully. His gray eyes shimmered in the glow as he looked at her. "Emily," he said softly, "these candles are for you. For every year you've fought, for every year you've survived, and for all the years to come, when you will never fight alone." Emily's lips trembled. Her gaze shifted between the glowing cake, the photograph of her mother, and Thomas's face. For a long moment she said nothing, then her small voice broke through the stillness. "Dad," she whispered. The word was shaky, unpracticed, but filled with so much meaning that Thomas felt his knees weaken. Tears welled in his eyes as Emily leaned into him, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. "Dad," she repeated, this time stronger, as tears rolled down her cheeks. Martha turned away, dabbing her eyes with the corner of her apron, while Grace clasped her hands together, murmuring a quiet prayer of thanks. Even Max seemed to understand, letting out a soft whine before pressing his head against Thomas and Emily, completing the embrace. Together, father and daughter leaned toward the cake. Emily closed her eyes, her lashes wet, and whispered a wish known only to her heart. Then she blew, the flames flickering out one by one until only smoke curled upward, dissolving into the twilight sky. As the last light of the day melted into the horizon, the garden shimmered in gold and violet. Emily laughed through her tears, Thomas's arm still around her, Max's collar gleaming with its new inscription. For the first time in many years, the Reed estate was no longer a house of silence and regret. It had become a home again. The photograph of Anna caught the last glimmer of the sun, her smile reflected in the glow of the candles. In that moment, it seemed as though she, too, was part of the celebration. Thomas whispered softly, a promise carried by the evening breeze. "Rest easy, Anna. She's safe. She's loved. We're a family now." And so, beneath the fading sunset, Emily Reed, her father Thomas, and their loyal protector Max stood together before the cake. The candles had gone out, but the light remained, an unshakable flame of love, healing, and a future no longer haunted by shadows. At the end of this story, we are reminded that even in the darkest storms, God can send a light, a second chance, a hidden miracle. A child's tear answered by love, or even the loyalty of a faithful dog. Emily's journey shows us that no matter how broken the past may seem, healing is possible when compassion and courage walk hand in hand. Thomas thought he had lost everything, but God restored to him not only a daughter, but also a family, reborn in grace. In our daily lives, we may not face kidnappers or lost children, but we do face loneliness, fear, and doubt. Remember that miracles still happen in small ways: a kind word, a protective friend, a moment of unexpected love. And just like Thomas and Emily, we can choose to open our hearts and let God write a new chapter of hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that love can triumph over pain. Leave a comment with your thoughts, tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe in God's blessings for families everywhere, write amen in the comments below. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so together we can keep spreading stories of hope, faith, and the miracles of love. May God bless you and your loved ones today and always. Amen.